I'm Brian Gorman. I am managing editor of Change Management Review. And on behalf of Teresa Moulton, our editor-in-chief, and myself and our entire team, welcome to this case study. Our guest for the case study today is Edwina Pike, otherwise known as Ed. And reading you Ed's biography would be sort of like trying to describe a hurricane in 5 words or less. If you know Ed, you know she is a force of nature in the world of change. And so, Ed, I'm just going to turn it over a minute to you to tell us a little bit about Ed Pike and irrational change and all of the disruptive stuff that you are doing in this work space.
Thank you, Brian. What a great setup. So Ed Pike, a 30-year change practitioner. So I think the best way of describing what we do is we use the last 30 years to work out what works and what doesn't work. Irrational change is our approach to change. And it basically challenges some of the assumptions that we have. It's interdisciplinary. We use behavioral science, neuroscience, anthropology, viral marketing. The list is long. We believe that the problem has probably been solved somewhere else. But today I am putting my M&A hat on. I spent 10 years of my career looking at M&A integration, and that is the most delicious change area ever. It's all about the people. So I'll stop there, Brian.
Okay, so we have a few questions that people sent in advance, and I'm going to ask you those, and then we're going to open the floor up for some other questions.
Awesome.
The first is, what 3 factors are critical to focus on from the outset of an M&A initiative from a change perspective?
Great question. Actually, I'm going to throw in one. How about we get people to put something in chat, maybe, and then see if it matches. So go for it in chat very quickly. What would you put yours in there? I know I'm throwing you a wobbly there, Brian, but you expect nothing less from me. Because I suspect that in chat, we'll get the first one for certain. Culture, Evan, thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, the first one is culture. When it comes to M&A and integration, it's all about culture. The second one is actually the same as a lot of other changes as well. It's actually value, where the value comes from. And then the third one, I would say, is mismatched expectations. So what expectations have been set? Yeah, because we believe in the expectations that are there. The other thing that I would add, probably as a bit of a bonus, is it's a bit like measure twice, cut once. I would say assess twice and then act once, because whatever you think is going to happen is not what's really going to happen. But I'll come on to that.
Thank you. At what stage of the M&A process should the change practitioner become involved, and why?
So I am going to describe an idealized situation, which is the world I lived in for 10 years, in the deal room. So I sat in the deal room. I was aware of the strategy. I sat in the deal room as part of the negotiating team. And that's where your change manager, or your change agent, your change practitioner has the most impact, because I was able to shape the deals we were doing to make them more implementable. It allowed me to create the relationships with the other side, with the senior leaders on our side, to reset expectations before they became anchored and became beliefs. So if you can have it, and I know it's a nirvana you don't always get, but believe me, I spent 10 years doing this, so it is possible. There are some enlightened businesses out there. The deal room is where you want to start, because the relationships and expectations you set during the deal process will make your integration process and your change process much, much easier. And believe me, I reshape deals because of it. Okay, right.
If I can add one thing there, when I was at KPMG, we actually were invited once to assess the likelihood of a deal delivering the promised benefits. And the outcome was that the merger didn't go forward. So
we've done that as well. It takes a brave leader to stop a deal, a really, really brave leader to stop a deal, because ego and status comes in, and it's very hard to walk away from something you've invested time in.
And
It's a very powerful place to be, and you can shape a hell of a lot. There's a lot of things that happen in the deal room that doesn't have direct value attached to them that you can shape if you're sitting in that room with the players.
and yet, even from a novice perspective, so many of us hear about deals that we say, this is just crazy. It's not going to work. For those of us with some age on us, remember Time Warner and AOL. What?
The frightening thing here is, I mean, everyone says, oh, yes, we do cultural due diligence and we do all the other due diligences. The reality is a lot of the time it's all about value, and they're looking at the financial numbers. Is your company worth the amount you said it was going to be worth? There may be some operational due diligence. Do you actually have the factories you say you have? And they really have the equipment that they said they had in there? But you'd be surprised at how little value is put on what I would call the cultural due diligence, the actual real nitty gritty of how people behave, the differences that there might be in the conflicts that come from that. Now, my role in the deal room I was able to assess that. I was able to read the room, and I would hit all of the financial due diligence team, said, what is your experience of working with the people? Yeah. So we would literally pull cultural due diligence, leadership due diligence from that, because that we knew made the big difference when it came to delivering value. I don't want to give away too much though, so.
You've begun to answer this next question. What are common pitfalls to avoid aside from culture?
The biggest one is mismatched expectations. And I know that sounds really simple, but you can soon spot where there is a difference of opinion or a difference of expectation or a different set of beliefs. And they exist everywhere in deals. And wherever they exist, they cause rot. The other one I would also say is I am a massive fan of an assumption tracker, because assumptions are really, really dangerous. The first thing I would brief, so I would be in the situation, I would be in the deal room ahead of time. So I was completely all over the deal. I had a strategy set up by the time we announced. But most of my integration teams knew nothing until the day of announcement because it's secret. And the first thing I would drill into absolutely everyone is expect surprises. Because however good you think due diligence is, if you make assumptions based on that, I can tell you, you will be proved wrong. So expect surprises is the way you go. A plan, it's flexible, because you will get surprises that you didn't know. Just like if you're buying a house, you think it's got heating that's working, you buy it in May and June when the heating doesn't need it, you get to October and you realize the pump's broken. Deals will surprise you. You need to be flexible, you need to be agile, and you need to know where your value is coming from. Which is key to everything. The other one I would say actually is underestimating the power of human choices, which sort of links a little bit back to culture, which is humans, there's a lot of willingness and humans can make choices. The power of that human choice and whether they make it or not is a really, really, really big pitfall if you aren't aware of it. So don't assume that just because it's said, it will get done. Humans will find a way to not do it. Yeah.
So we have some questions here, Ed, that may give away too much.
Okay.
So I'm gonna ask them, and you can feel free to defer your response to later. Parent co is buying brand co based on 5-year expected performance. Are there conditions to the deal based on performance? And if they do not hit the expected numbers, what happens?
Yeah, so in this particular example, and I've used a mashup of a couple of examples to try and make it a little bit, but you may start to work some of it out. Yes, in this particular example, it was 5 years. So it's an extremely high price for a five-year thing. But the belief and the growth that was expected was coming out of that was expected and was seen to be a good deal. It was actually contingent, so structured, 700 million based on the actual sale value itself, and another 300 million, which would then bring it up to $1 billion based on I think it was a 5-year earnout, I can't remember exactly, which was based on volume, margin and profit. So the classic value growth type levers that are there. And I would also just say that for the trackability of where I took that data from is they are still tracking ahead of plan. So sense of pride.
The case study stated that power resides regionally. The divisional president has a desire to change the culture of her division. Realistically, how much power does she have to do that? And is the CEO in support of this culture shift? And if yes, does he want to bring that change to the entire organization?
Great question and well spotted. there's a few things like that in there. So if you think about a regional president is successful if they deliver their numbers. That's the way a lot of organizations work. So if my success is based on delivering my numbers, there's a sort of happy medium that needs to be had between the countries that deliver and me as a divisional president. So if I push too hard, they might choose not to deliver. So there's a real happy medium that needs to be found. Now, divisional presidents do have some level of authority, but it's balanced with the markets themselves and the countries and how they perform and whether they choose to take the divisional president's lead or not. So good catch. Just because they're the divisional president doesn't mean that it's a command and control environment. It's more of a servant leadership where actually I am in servants of my country level, but I try and bring the top down as well. But it's a sort of like I'm between a rock and a hard place, really.
Has Parenco leadership considered how they could bring an entrepreneurial get it done spirit while retaining the efficiencies of central systems?
So that is one of the solutions we came up with. So I'm going to take the fifth on that one because you may explore the reasons why, but that is one of the elements resolves for that.
What levels of independence has Branco been assured, and is the divisional finance director on board with that?
Good question. So in the end, with this particular Branco, we assured them some autonomy around marketing. We assured them some autonomy around growth. We also protected them around back office services as well. Yeah. So if you want to think about in your groups or however it's going to break out, think about the sort of things that you would put in place as a change agent in order to protect the value that you've got there.
So we have a couple in the chat, and then we're going to open it up. Let me scroll up here. What types of data would you collect as part of cultural due diligence?
So we take a belief that culture is formed by one or two things, leadership and crisis. So we watch the leaders, we watch how the leaders behave, and then we look at the dynamic that creates in their teams. So I'm particularly looking for things like empowerment. I'm looking for things like the level of decision making, where that happens. I'm looking at where the power sits in the organization. I'm looking at all of those dynamics around power, decision making, choices that get made, strength of leadership. That sort of areas where I head to. And I actually take data from a very wide set of areas because you don't get a pure, you don't get to go and do what we would do. So you're taking secondhand data. So you take it from anywhere. I will read news reports. I look online. I look in so many different places. You also watch the dynamic in the deal room like crazy, especially the dynamic between the senior leadership team who are normally present in the deal room, and who's who and how they really interrelate and interact. There's one deal. No, actually, I'll say that story.
Okay. One more question in the chat, and then we're going to throw the floor open here. Would the assumption tracker be in Excel?
Yeah, as simple as Excel. I track three things. So I track the assumption I'm making, and I do this really early on. And the best advice I've got for you, it sounds like such a simple thing, is really before you even start thinking, you are making assumptions all the time. So you start tracking your assumptions and track two things by the side of it. The first one is your percentage of confidence of that assumption. Yeah. What is your percentage confidence? Now, the reason why you do that is the minute you make an assumption, your brain, a bit of neuroscience here, your brain naturally tries to reinforce that assumption, and it starts to believe the assumption more and more over time. So there's a danger in your own brain of believing your assumptions more than they are. So track the percentage confidence you've got, and then track the impact of your change, your project, if that assumption was to fail, high, medium, or low. Yeah. And then the rigor, when you go through your weekly dashboard, whatever you're doing, go back and check your assumptions. Because believe me, we can believe assumptions because they feel like they are truth when they really aren't truth. So assumption, percentage, confidence, and what's the impact, high, medium, low on your project or change, and check it weekly and recognize your brain is trying to confuse you.
Okay, we're going to be breaking you up into breakout rooms in just a few minutes, but before we do, what other questions do people have? Just feel free to unmute and jump in?
Sorry, I just the end of that.
Go ahead, Fiona.
Oh, I just wanted to check. So it's the impact of change project if that assumption is true.
Yeah. So if that assumption fails,
this idea, I'm trying to do it. I want to do it.
No, so if the assumption fails, what's going to be the impact of your project? So if I'm assuming that 90% of the employees have contracts, and I find out that actually 30% of them do, and they're all going to walk. So what's the impact of the assumption I'm making? So if that assumption is important to you, and then what's the impact if you're wrong? Therefore, the ones you want to be highlighting, if you get a 2x2 grid, I hang out with strategists too much, you'd highlight and track, even more closely the ones that are low confidence and high impact. Yeah, because those are the ones that are most dangerous. So you can 2x2 grid it if you want to as well. But it's a simple tool, but it's a behavioral hack that's worth putting on every project.
Thank you.
David, I think you had a question.
Yeah, and it's actually building on the assumption tracking as well, which, by the way, love that idea. How do you handle the fact that you're not the only one making those assumptions? So, I go to CEO Ed and I say, hey, Ed, I want to verify this because this is what I believe to be true. And they're like, oh, 100% absolutely. Meanwhile, it's actually an assumption on their part and they haven't climbed down the ladder yet.
So proactively check for assumptions, check assumptions and beliefs in others all the time. And the minute you get a glimmer that there's a disconnect or there's some conflict in what people are thinking or what people are saying, note it. Now, you may not be able to deal with all of it. Yeah. So, for example, a buyer, I think we said in this one, I'll give you a clue on this one. The company to be acquired was really, really looking forward to, I think you're on the case study, looking forward to using the manufacturing capacity. So I knew that was their belief. I knew that was their assumption, that they would get access to global manufacturing. It was going to reduce their cost to manufacture. But I also knew on the other side, on our side, that the cost of running this down our line, you wouldn't stop a line for this. This would go in hand filling, this would go down our luxury line. Our luxury line is not the cheapest line to run because the volumes are so small. So we probably wouldn't move it into our global manufacturing environment yet. So for me, it was spotting the points of conflict, identifying what those are, and just catching when people are in two very different places. Now, sometimes in the deal negotiation, you let it run. Sometimes it's going to be once we get the deal closed, then we'll clarify and do. The ones I would always watch for most was any on our side where our senior leaders had completely the wrong assumptions. And I would catch it, and your radar goes off very quickly. Once your radar goes off, speak up quickly. It's one of those things best said quickly and not left to build its own life. So go for it.
Okay, any other questions for Ed before we send you into brainstorm your strategies for this acquisition and come back with your thoughts and recommendations? Okay, we are going to actually give you 35 minutes for brainstorming, and that'll give us about a half an hour to debrief and find out how Ed's secret formula made this work. If you have other questions at any time, feel free to come back out and ask us.
Enjoy. Look forward to hearing what you get out with it.
Looks like we're all back.
Okay. So let's hear what you all came up with. Who's our first spokesperson? Who do we have from breakout room 3?
I wasn't shy.
I don't know which number I was on the last one from my group.
Well,
I
we
love
lost.
the fact
We
you
lost.
think we know our numbers, Brian.
That's okay. We lost a
Really.
few people.
I know.
We lost a few people. Ellen, what happened in your breakout?
Well, I went in with not a lot of context and lost my 2 colleagues on the way out. So I can just share that we had a group conversation around readiness assessment and how that's being done to ensure that the teams are ready for the change. So it was Eduardo, Amy, and I, and another gentleman who joined briefly, and talking about like how you get that done and how you bring that back to the teams in terms of readiness on everything, culture, systems, leadership readiness, how people are feeling about the processes that might change, even their roles and things like that, and how there's synergies or maybe even disposition happens through all of that, and how do you bring that back and check it along the way. Some of the conversation we had around was you don't just do that once. So I was describing how we're in the middle of an acquisition. We're being acquired, so we're going to be company being acquired, and I'm kind of one remove from the folks actually doing a lot of the change management. They outsource to McKinsey, so I'm kind of one remove from the actual work. And look at his face. And versus, so we're being acquired by Sun Life. I'm with DentaQuest, which is a much smaller organization. So even saying change management sounds scary where we are. So I can now poke around with my McKinsey friends and ask if I'm assuming they did a readiness assessment, but I'm really just getting the results of it, which is unfortunate. And of course they call it a communication plan, not a change management plan. So I'm just getting dumped with communication. So so we talked a little bit about how you do it overall. So if they even did what we talked about in our team with the readiness assessment, is that you have to kind of check in along the way. So it's not a one and done, which was helpful for me, right? Because I missed the first step on that train. And now being able to use some of that language to say, oh, so how did the readiness go on culture? Or how did team ABC feel about the process change and things like that, versus just handing over a bunch of communications that I won't have a lot of context to. So, so again, I didn't have the context going into the room. I'm bringing out what we discussed. So hopefully that's helpful for the group.
Great. Thank you. Okay. In room one, we had Aman, Gaddis, Kobus, and Melanie. Who wants to share what came out of your conversation?
Okay.
Go for Melanie.
Right, I'm going for it. Okay, well, I stepped in and said, I love the readiness assessment because we hadn't talked about that kind of thing at all. Basically, we looked at, Kobus was talking to us about 1 + 1 = 3. In other words, if you are buying another organization, you need to know that by putting the two organizations together, you will get that extra +1, that extra value. And we were looking at how, and this comes very much from my own experience, which is how you can actually lose that value. In fact, even worse, you can lose the value of the organization you bought. So I thought the red herring in what Edwina had put together was the fact that, the finance director wants to put them all onto the legacy systems and basically kill off Brandco and any innovation within Brandco, because you're going to talk 18 months to 2 years, putting them onto systems and making no difference at all. So I sort of said, right, okay, what we cut through is that we make use of ParentCo's distribution method domestically. Let's try to grow domestically before we grow globally. If we can get the distribution to increase the volume, then when we do put it into the next step, which is into ParentCo's manufacturing domestically, it won't be so small that it completely screws up their production lines. And it is that chicken and egg, and it's always a bit of a nightmare. But I think you just sometimes have to cut through it and go, don't waste your time on systems. What that's doing is putting all the sort of perfect infrastructure in place. Meanwhile, you haven't sold any more product. You haven't, and the whole point of hooking up with somebody bigger was that they could get more of your stuff out to more customers. So let's just keep that in mind. That was my view anyway.
Any additional adds to that from the others in Melanie's breakout room?
Yeah, I had a slightly, unfortunately, Melanie left the room. I hope it wasn't because of what I said I was going to say.
No. I have a man on my roof telling me my pipes are corroded. So I just, the fact that he's pinned up on the roof by a 12-stone St. Bernard was causing some difficulty.
No. What I was just thinking is that ParentCo, in this case, is an industrial company. And you effectively have a good brand. So what I would do is actually not do a full merger integration. What I would rather do is actually do a rights project or rights transaction by giving the actual company access to my brand and let them pay me for the rights privileges of that particular brand, but not making myself stuck in the industrial company alone. I would then take my brand and actually go to a major e-commerce platform like Alibaba and do something in the digital space as well. So therefore split the value of my brand through consumption with the industrial co, the parent co, and then actually go on to a new venture with the money that I'm making into the digital world, where I could scale a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, but not do the one, let's say, instead of the other. The 1 + 1 = 3 needs to work on both the digital world and the industrial world. Anyway, that's my view.
Great, Cobus. Thank you. Anyone else from the room with Melanie and Cobus have anything to add? Okay, then we jump into Jennifer, Cordina, and Willem.
I can start off and then you guys can add in. We talked about how difficult that cultural change was going to be, and we thought about taking it more of maybe a joint venture approach. Not exact joint venture, but somewhat of that approach, so that they could do what they need to do while parent co can do the supporting of them, and then start doing it very incrementally, the culture change, and make it like this multi-year process, roadmap, everything that's going to change, to start setting those expectations of what will happen.
Others? Anything anyone has to share that came out of your conversations or you're thinking now before we turn it over to our force of nature?
One quick bite that I mentioned in the group, which is, Ed, what you mentioned at the beginning of the session about doing the cultural due diligence, and the temperature check by being in the deal room has been very significant. And I think I would want to plug that as part of the strategy here as well for this case study, precisely because it's different. Not a lot of times you would have a change lead or a cultural specialist as part of the deal room, which is why we tend to bring them at the very end, once people are in the door and they're struggling, and then trying to put the Band-Aid on it doesn't really work. So starting from the right at the beginning is something that it sounds theoretically idealistic. I don't know what challenges practically come up, and I would love to hear from you on. I'm sure during 10 years in the M&A space, you would have worked with organizations that might not want to have a change specialist in the deal room for good or bad reasons. Sometimes the deals don't work for good in the long term, but people don't see it in the short term. So that's something that stood out for me, and I would love to hear on that a little bit more from you.
Okay, so we're going to turn the floor over to Ed. She does have a repeatable model PDF, which we will be sharing with you after the event is over here. So Ed, tell me when you want me to bring up the slides, and the floor is yours.
I will do. So thank you. So yes, you spotted more than I thought. So well done. I'm just going to talk, Cobus, I'm just going to cover off your points first, because I think if I can get the deal ones done, then you'll at least see where we got to. It's in an organization's interest to own 100% of a brand, because as the brand grows, the value to buy the rest gets more and more expensive. So you want to buy a brand when it's in a low quantity of volume, and you want to own it 100%, because otherwise the earn-out becomes just that much more expensive and you're paying much more expense for it. Now, in this case, it's an interesting one because the preference of the guys I was working with, they wanted to be a brand owner. They wanted to own it 100%. They wanted to have the full equity value of that. So having something like a rights issue was not of interest to them because they wanted to own it. It was strategically important to them, and ownership was all what it was all about. But that does come with the issue, the fact that, as you guys highlighted, that this is a real mismatch. In fact, I did a crib sheet of all of the points of conflict, and there are loads of points of conflict from scale, from manufacturing, from the fact, I love the fact, I think you picked it up, Melanie, what a great spot. That tension between the president and the CFO, there is an absolute need for a mature organization to normalize any acquisition it makes to their own behaviors. And even if they say the right words, we're going to use you, we want your entrepreneurial spirit. And I hear this in the tech space, the pharma space. I want to bring your entrepreneurial spirit in. The need to normalize. Big organizations have processes, structures, hierarchies, guidelines. They operate like that because it makes it easy for them to operate. Yep. And the drive to normalize is so strong, it absolutely wipes out the value that you have. So to Melanie's point, spot on and exactly. And you see it everywhere, and you have to catch it everywhere. And you have to catch it in the moment everywhere. And you have to put protective barriers up against that normalization pull. To the point you made. The readiness, yes, we do check readiness on the way through. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we did this, because we got very selective about when, at the point that Jennifer made, we got very, very selective. Now, again, joint venture, not really appropriate. We wanted to own the whole brand because that's where the value is. We wanted to buy it now, not when it was a million cases, because then the value and the cost would go up massively. But operating in a separated world where they could cherry pick the best part became our best strategy. Now, I just want to check here, make best use of parent code. I think you said that one, Melanie, which is brilliant, spot on. I'm going to do that. In fact, it's almost like you've read my slides, so well done. We talked about readiness assessments, yes, on the way through. There are a lot of synergies, but you have to choose very carefully, and you have to work out whether the synergy you're looking for is likely to destroy value or it's going to add to the value. And I want to, yeah, let's go with the slides, Brian, if you've got them, and then I can talk you through. So we codified this, and we did not get it right in the early days. We listened to the great words that presidents would say about entrepreneurship and that we would give autonomy, and we watched organizations being subsumed. We watched them being taken over as they come through. So we codified this into a relatively straightforward set of questions that we would ask. And we actually looked at it through 4 lenses. And actually, I think Melanie's picked up on a whole bunch of those lenses. If you just flip on, Brian, thank you. This looks a little complicated. There's actually only one section we're going to talk about, which is that integration strategy. And the benefit of having a me in the deal room is I could create that along the way, and I could assess the risks, I could assess the value, and I could assess the talent. Now, we had some principles, and you need to know the principles of the acquirer that you're in. The first one is, what are the long-term goals? Now, we had a goal to always integrate. Ultimately, long-term, we always wanted to integrate. We wanted to own those brands. If you're in an organization that likes to buy and sell brands a lot, you may choose not to integrate because it's easier to sell a brand when it is not integrated. And always know your sources of value and risk. And when we would buy across emerging markets. So we would walk into bribery risk. We were talking to health and safety risks. We would talk of where the value comes from. And the value may come from a visionary founder. You always, always, always have to be grounded as to where your value is and where the risks come from as well. And then we wanted to set things up for sustainable success. We were in this for the long term. We were not in this for a short, sharp, I'm going to grow it for 3 to 5 years, a bit like a private equity house does, and then I'm going to sell it on a higher price. We wanted long-term success. Go, Melanie.
I don't know if, Brian, if you've got it not in presentation mode or something, but I don't know if the rest of you, but it's flickering and it's just on the eyes. It's just, am I the only one that's getting that? Or?
I was going to say, I sent Brian a PDF, but I can share it from mine if you want me to share it instead.
Yeah, it's definitely something's going on where you think you're looking at it and then it flicks and it's flickering so much that my eyeballs are going.
Well, I had it. Now it's gone.
Okay. No, I've got it. I've got it.
I took it off screen so that Ed can share here.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
So we looked at this through 4 lenses, and this was the 4, like the 4 buckets that I would look at as my assessment. I would assess where the value comes from, because if you don't know where your value comes from, it's easy to make a misstep and you can destroy your value very quickly. I have to say in the modern world, the synergistic value of I can just put two manufacturing plants together has pretty much disappeared. Nowadays, it's all about growth. It's about marketing. It's about how I can do that sort of value synergies, which are much, much harder to achieve. We'd assess the risks. What are the risks? Do we have to fix some stuff? There may be a health and safety issue. It may be an ethics issue that we have to fix. The talent, it's all about the people. So the point Melanie made before, the process, the systems, the guidelines, all the stuff that's there, the value sits in the people and the choices that they make. So talent becomes a key assessment. And then we call this maturity. Yeah, but I know you guys looked at it around, what do we do on assessments? I think, Melanie, you talked a little bit about it as well. But we call it something called maturity. And maturity is wherever there's a disconnect in maturity. So one has mature processes and systems, the other one has emerging process systems, or the other way around. One has entrepreneurial, emerging, flexible marketing, and the other one has really staid marketing. And, if wherever there's a disconnect, there's conflict. We would use those four to choose an archetype. I'm going to talk about that in a second. There was a load of governance and accountability that ran at the same time, and we used to learn from it. So not rocket science. You'll get these slides anyway. When we came to the integration strategy, we'd ask ourselves four things. Where are the sources of value? Where does the value actually exist? We'd ask, is the value dependent on integration? Because sometimes it isn't. Yeah. And what will it take to get to that value? We'd ask ourselves about risks. Again, what are the risks? How urgently do we have to address them? And what alternatives are there? We'd ask about the founder. If you're in a founder or charismatic-led business, often they have a disproportionate amount of contribution to value. So how important is the founder and how are they motivated? Some founders loved the babies. They loved the first 2 years, but they didn't want to do the growth stage. Others wanted to be in it for life. We had some founders who really didn't want to let go, yet we had an agreement to buy 100% of their company. And that feels really bad when you don't want to let go. What's the best environment for them? How can we enable them to be successful, which may be different to the environment we would use for our midlifers who are in the organization and in a career job? And then it was the attitude and aptitude of the team, and how does that drive value? We'd also look at the maturity. So how different are they? What different maturity levels do they have? What would it take to upweight maturity? So how will it take? So if they're on an Excel spreadsheet for their finances and we're on SAP, what we knew was we had to get into a level of maturity before we can move across to SAP. Trying to make a leap up and use a process or system change to force that was rarely going to be successful. To give you some idea as well, we would have 20 people in the room, all with specialist roles. They would face off against one finance director. And that poor finance director would be overwhelmed with the number of requests that they had, which led us to think about things a little bit differently and to think about how can we protect our acquisitions from the normalization of the parent rather than have them normalize and lose the value that we had just acquired. And this is how we did it. We used a heat map approach. So we took every acquisition, we took the value, the risks, the talent, and the maturity. We asked ourselves a lens for each of the functions that there was available. So in marketing, for this particular acquisition, do we keep it separate for the value, or do we keep it neutral, or do we actually integrate it? Now, in the case study I've given you, we kept marketing separate. So to the point about joint venture, keeping things separate, yes, we kept it separate. We kept it separate. It had its own specific team. It had competitive advantage in keeping it separate. It was actually run by one of the founders who was very well known, and his own social media and presence was so huge that there was a benefit of keeping it separate. Same with sales. Now, sales was an interesting one. As you picked up, this could be an annoyance in some markets. It could be an absolute annoyance because it's so small. And why the hell would I go out of my way to sell this hard to sell brand that nobody's heard of yet, or is just beginning to hear of, when I can sell one of my regular brands that is like easy? So sales was by country, and it came down to how much could we pull this brand into that business. So I actually did sit in a room with the new brand and said, I think your sales in this particular market are better done through a third party and not through us, because we could not generate the commitment to the brand. Logistics really came down to where do you do? Now the assess risks and integrate came down to things like standards on packaging, making sure that registrations were done. There's actually quite a lot of rules and regs when you're in a consumer goods business as to what you can and can't do. And that meant that there was a level of standardization that would be there. Yeah. But we knew it was going to be difficult and it would potentially add costs. Innovation, we kept separate because the talent of the founders to innovate was massive, and they had an ability to innovate really quickly and to turn and learn very quickly. And then finally, talent, we kept it separate. It was a small business. It operated as a team and they moved quickly, and we didn't want to ruin the movement of that team and the ability to think quickly. On the back office, we were relatively neutral. It didn't have a value on either way, but what gave us the biggest issue was maturity. Moving from an Excel spreadsheet to SAP is a massive jump, and you cannot do that overnight. So we used to come up with an archetype that used to fit for every company we had, which is our strategy, is whether things were separate or whether they were together. But we didn't just have a decision for separate or not. We also agreed up front and set the expectations clearly about what would trigger the integration. So for marketing, when the founder loses interest, while the founder still has an interest, they can continue marketing. The minute they lose interest, that's it. We will integrate. As soon as possible, if we can move the sales in, because then we get the full margin benefit. We had a plan for logistics and manufacturing. It wasn't the easiest thing to do, but we had a plan for it. And once we had a great plan, we would then look to integrate, but it needed a plan first because it wasn't the easiest thing to do. Again, on innovation, the founder was massive on innovation. So when the founder lost interest, we would move innovation across. Now, talent was an interesting one, very different benefit and very different salary levels, as you can imagine. A big global conglomerate pays better salaries, has a much broader sense of benefits. And meanwhile, you've got a startup environment where some people are incentivized very highly to generate growth. Others are in it for the experience that they can get as a smaller company. And you have to harmonize the benefits before you can even think about moving them across. We actually kept the human element, the human population separate for 2 years, which gave them great flexibility. They didn't have to abide by the rules and regs of the corporate other than the must-do policies. And there are some must-do and some not must-dos. But we worked to then harmonize the benefits and bring them into a similar level. And then finally, on the back office, it all came down to when the maturity levels met, then they would move across. In this example, we actually had the rule that the organization we were acquiring got to choose when they moved into the parent company or not. So when it was good for them, they moved it across. Meanwhile, we had expectations of their delivery of value, their delivery of growth, their delivery of volume. So I'm just going to pause there for a second, because if you think about how this works with some of your other changes that are going on, and what you have to protect and where your value is, there's a lot of similarity. So I'll pause there. Ask questions.
And for the back office, I was wondering when you said the maturity raised, is it when it became too painful for them to do whatever they were doing currently?
No, because even if it's painful, if you've ever done outsourcing, there's always a golden rule in outsourcing, which is don't ever outsource a problem to somebody else, because when you outsource a problem to somebody else, you're creating even more of a problem because they're less capable of fixing it because they're not close to the front end. No, we actually required them to meet maturity levels. Now, one of the things that the big corporate had was it used to close on working day 2 as a financial back end. So all of its finances, all of its month-end close was done by working day 2. So one of the criteria that sat under this maturity level was once you can close your books at working day 2, once we can harmonize the chart of accounts, then you can move across, but not until then. Does that make sense? So there was beneath this was a level of detail that said, this is the evidence before you move across. This is the evidence you've reached the maturity level. Now, we did actually have to rescue one of our businesses because the financial controller, unbeknown to us, again, remember I said about surprises? I don't think I'm telling a story out of school here. The financial controller, so the founders had assumed that we would just immediately put it on our back office. They didn't know our plan to not. And they had basically offered the financial controller, the one person who did all the finances, a 6-month sabbatical in Africa. She was off to Tanzania in 3 weeks' time. So if you can imagine, we've just acquired a business and I find out on the point of closing that the financial controller, who we assumed, bad assumption, would remain through the period until we can get the maturity levels right, was basically off in 3 weeks' time. So we had to very quickly hire some financial controllers to basically learn her job using Excel and her very basic accounting methods to keep the business running whilst we got the maturity level raised. Imagine as well trying to bring a very, very small team onto a massive ERP system. It's a very expensive process and there isn't much return on investment as well. What you have to know though, as your hack, is what the organization really needs. What is the minimum standard that is acceptable? And the minimum standard is often that the right numbers are in the right financial reporting system, not necessarily the transaction system, the right financial reporting system on a timely basis. And we just made sure that happened. The other thing we did, as well, and I think it was alluded to in the conversations as well, is we created like an interface team, you might call it, a team who basically acted as the interface. So that instead of the acquired company talking directly to the parent, which was overwhelming, there was a team that used to translate in the middle, who were friendly to the acquirer. They understood their needs and could help them out and be a friendly voice, but also understood how the parent worked. So they could translate the needs and also mitigate and bounce things from the parent as well when they're making requests they shouldn't be making, and just make it look and feel more similar to the parent so the parent didn't freak out. It was basically a translation facing off to both sides team. And there's about 4 or 5 people sitting in that team, marketing, sales, finance, and they basically just face off. And that creates a single point of contact. So the parent doesn't speak directly to the acquired business unless it's absolutely appropriate to do so.
Other questions for Ed?
Ed, I was wondering, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in all of this, is change management, is it, my experience is that it's not recognized as a management discipline. So there is not an automatic bringing in of change management specialists to lead all of this. We bring in finance experts. I'm overrun with lawyers like cockroaches, but there's nobody in change management, no offense to those in the legal profession, but you know, there's nobody in the change management space who are handling this. Is that just my bad experiences or generally?
No, that's spot on. And my job was not as a change manager. There was the word change was not in my job title anywhere. And I did not speak about the word change. And actually, that's one of the things I would definitely say to you is if you want to be valued for what you do, lose the word change and speak about it, because the word change is often commoditized and seen as being like an associate can come in and do things. And I would talk about value. I would talk about value realization. My job was actually M&A integration. But 90% of what I did, every skill I pulled on was the skills I have as a change manager and change agent. But I would not have been given the elevated position that I was given if I was positioned as change. I would be seen as being somebody who does the comms and training after the deal is done.
Yeah.
So it's about repositioning, remarketing, but every skill you use, 90% of my day job was all about change management, culture assessments, communications, engagement, leadership, readiness, all of the things we do. A little bit of business stuff on the top end, so I understood deals. That was about it. So Melanie, you're spot on. It's rare to find an enlightened organization that does this. Most of it will come in after the deal is announced, and then they'll suddenly think, oh, we need to bring a change manager into this.
I think that's amazing.
Yeah,
I apologize. I joined very late because I had a conflict, but I didn't want to miss this because I was excited about it. What did you call yourself? So what did they call your role?
So my role was called M&A Integration Director. And actually I had 2. So I would sometimes be called Strategy Execution Director, because the idea was that when I wasn't doing M&A, which was for like about 3 months in 10 years, then I would genuinely go rock up on scary big change projects and basically advise them. They walk away because I had a deal to do. But no, I talk, so strategy execution, I talk about value realization, anything but change. I talk in their language, not my language.
I think that's so interesting to hear, because all of us being change management, or most of us being change management professionals on this phone, it's true that sometimes your value for some reason in certain situations decreases when they hear change management, but the skills that we bring, exactly, it's how you sell yourself. So
in my organization, change managers were seen as being commodity items that sat underneath a project, and they were there to deliver change and training. So I knew that in order for me to be successful, I needed to not be called change. And I got to, I was well respected, so I got to choose my job title. I know that's an unusual, rare thing to do. They knew the function they wanted me to offer, and I got to choose my own job title, and I did not put change in my job title. And that was a very, very deliberate act, but that's what gave me the credibility. And they, if I'm honest, they think I do black magic. They think I have some magic wand that is unique, and it really isn't. It's just good change management. And they don't understand how I do what I do, but it came to the stage that they wouldn't move without me. And that's where you want them to be.
Yeah.
But before they do anything, they get you involved right up front because they value the conversation. They value what you bring to the picture. I give insights because data is power. So I would give insights from the deal room that they weren't picking up on that would then potentially have value to the deal as well. So yeah, I would also analyze the deal process and give them some behavioral insights around their own behavior in the deal room, which is quite interesting. So that was a fun task to do.
That's awesome.
Well, we are over time, folks.
Sorry.
This has been great. We didn't record the breakouts, obviously, but we did record pre and post breakout, and we will make that recording available to you as well as Ed's deck. Any final words for us? Hurricane Ed.
Expect surprises. And also, it's never a merger. It's never a merger. It's always a takeover. Just work out who's going to be the lead party and quickly align behind what their objectives are, because otherwise it's just going to be painful. And the faster you line up behind the top dog, the less painful it will be, and the more of an advantage you will get as a first mover. And I see Melanie's nodding as well. Yeah, it's never a merger. It's always an acquisition.
No, it's always this M&A rubbish. No, it's AAA. Yeah, or it could be BBB, bye. But whoever the buyer is the one with the power, you know, and that's who you suck up to.
Exactly. Work out who's coming in as top dog and line up behind them very quickly. And that will give you first mover advantage. The other thing I would probably add as my other final one is change is not really planned out as much as you think it is. You know, when you're doing big strategic moves like this, there is not really a micro plan of what the outcome is going to be, which means that you have the opportunity to take space and to shape the outcomes more than you think you have, but you have to be in the game to do it. If you wait for it to be done to you, it's the old adage, you know, about your career. If you wait for somebody else, if you don't manage your own career, somebody else manage it for you. Well, times of change are not that settled. That is your opportunity to dive in and shape your outcome more than you think. So there you go. Make it yours. Don't regret it later.
Ed, thank you so much on behalf of everyone here and those who had to leave, and on behalf of Change Management Review. This has been fabulous. And thank you all for your time and your engagement with this. We've learned from you as well.
Thanks, everybody.